Hey guys, it's David here with Fressler Tech giving you a brief tutorial on how to create a simple DotnetCore Web API using the Dotnet CLI and Visual Studio Code. Microservices serve as the core building blocks of any modern web application. Developing your application as a mesh of interacting web APIs with very specific responsibilities allows for greater scalability, independence between services and developers, and heterogeneity between stacks best suited for different tasks. The separation between the web APIs and your web application UI is so that you can reuse the web APIs across multiple UIs, such as web, Android, and iPhone. A container is a standard unit of software that packages up code and all of its dependencies so the application runs quickly and reliably from one computing environment to another. A Docker container is a lightweight, standalone, executable package of software that includes everything needed to run an application: code, runtime, settings, tools, system libraries. This tutorial will teach you how to build a .NET Web API and create a Docker container image for those services. Before you begin this tutorial, please make sure that you've installed all of the dependencies and prerequisites detailed in the description of the video, or follow the link to my website for a little bit more information on those prerequisites. After you've downloaded and installed all of the dependencies in the description of the video, open your terminal or command prompt and create a new folder or Git repository for the application that we're about to create. So for this example, I've created the Cube course folder, and then I'm going to actually scaffold my web API into this folder. All right, so let's get started. So first we're going to use the .NET CLI to create a new web API. We're going to output the artifacts for the project for this web API into a folder called web API. And then we're actually going to specify that we don't want to use HTTPS, so no HTTPS. And the reason why we don't want to use SSL for this project to begin with is because once we've containerized our application, we're actually going to utilize the Azure Kubernetes cluster to actually manage all the SSL for all of our containers. So we're going to establish an ingress controller, and within that ingress controller is where we're going to manage our certificates and all of our SSL. All right, so let's go ahead and run that command to create the new project. And you can see that it was doing a bit of restoration and that we were able to scaffold the project successfully. Let's go to the web API folder, and then we can open up Visual Studio Code by just running code dot, and that'll open up the current directory as the workspace. All right, so once you have Visual Studio Code open, you can actually go to the debug panel here and click run and debug. So what this is going to do, you can see that Visual Studio Code was smart enough to suggest that this might be a .NET Core project. So we're going to click .NET Core, and what's going to happen is that Visual Studio Code was able to scaffold for us a launch configuration for our project automatically. All right, so once we have this debug configuration, we can actually go ahead and click Start Debugging to spin up our web API. And so this should have opened a page inside of your web browser. And as you can see, we're getting a 404. So our web API has actually been started, but for some reason it can't find the root location for our web API. And let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. So if you go to the File Explorer, inside of .NET Core projects, we have these things called controllers. And so these controllers actually manage all of the routing and all of the logic. They're basically the first layer of the endpoints for your web API. And so within the controller, you can see we have this route attribute. So we're actually taking the name of the controller and using it as the location inside of the web API. So all of the traffic, all of the requests to your web API that are going to come to this weather forecast controller need to go through the weather forecast endpoint. So let's go back into our application inside of the browser, and then we're actually going to navigate to the weather forecast endpoint. So now you can see that we actually have some data. All right, congratulations on getting your first web API up and running. So now we want to take that web API and we actually want to containerize it using the Docker extension for VS Code. So I'm going to go into my extensions for VS Code here, and I'm actually going to search for Docker. And as you can see, I already have the extension installed, but you'd be able to install it through this panel. And then we can go back to the Explorer, and we're going to click, and we're going to type Control-Shift-P, and then we're going to search for the option to add Docker files to Workspace. And then we're going to use the ASP.NET Core configuration. We're going to select Linux as the operating system for our container image. And then we're going to use port 5000 for our container. We're not going to create any Docker Compose files. So let's talk a little bit about what this Docker file actually is. So the Docker file specifies how to build your container image, and then it also specifies for the orchestrator how to run your container. So the first step here is to get from the Microsoft Container Registry the ASP.NET Core 5.0 base layer image. We're going to create an app directory. We're going to expose port 5000, and then we're going to set some environment variables. We're going to set up some user configuration, and then we're actually going to switch to a different build image. So we're going to actually use the SDK image to do our build. So we move things around a bit. We do a restore on our project, and then we actually perform the .NET build for the project. And so we use the release configuration here to have a trade-off between observability and performance. So you can think in your production environment, you've already done all of the debugging and all of the testing necessary to be ready for production. So you no longer need debugging symbols and all of the infrastructure necessary to have that observability for your executable. So you trade off all of that bloat for a more optimized executable, which will be better able to handle the scale of your production environment and all the customers that you have inside of your production environment. So then we publish our web application using the release configuration again, and then we switch back to our base image, our runtime image. So the base image is going to be a bit more lightweight than the SDK image. You can think of an SDK image as containing all of the tools and tool chains necessary to build your executable, but the runtime image just needs to know how to run your executable. Okay, and then lastly, we specify the entry point for this container. So when we hand off the container to the container orchestrator, we're going to specify, okay, in order to spin up this container, you're going to call .NET, and you're going to specify webapi.dll as the web API that we want to run using the .NET CLI. So now that we have our Docker file, we actually want to build our container image. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the Docker CLI. We're going to specify that we want to build. We're going to provide the name of our web API. We're going to specify that we're using version 1. And then we're going to specify the path to the Docker file, which is our current directory. So this will actually start building your Docker image, your container image. And once this is actually built, you can run your container. And this may take a little bit of time the first time that you run build. Essentially what it's doing is it's reaching out to the Microsoft Container Registry to pull the images that you'll need to build this final image. But essentially the next time that you build this image, you'll already have those base layers cached. So once we've successfully created our new Docker image, we're actually going to use the Docker CLI again to run the Docker image on our local machine. So we're going to use Docker run -it -rm. We're going to use the -p flag to specify 8081 as the port on our local machine where we want to map to the internal port of the container image of the container. Okay, and then we're going to specify the image name that we created, the image name of the image that we just created, and then it was version 1 again. So let's go ahead and run this command. And as you can see, it looks like it successfully began our web API. So if you navigate to the same location, port 5000 for the weather forecast controller, you can see that that location no longer works because we've actually stopped our debugging session. And so our web API is no longer running outside of the container that we just created. So we map this to port 8081 on our local machine. And here you can see the data that we had previously inside of our Docker container image now. .NET Core uses many best practices to define conventions for building scalable web applications. .NET Core Web APIs use controllers to control requests coming to a web API. These controllers serve as the starting point for functional development. In the scaffolded example, we start with a weather forecast controller that returns random JSON data. In our case, we may not want weather data or data in JSON format. We may simply want to return hello world or do some complicated business logic. In order to change the functionality of your Docker container, you must update the controller logic, rebuild the Docker image, restart the Docker container, and you'll be done there. Now let's go to our controller, the one controller that we have inside of the project. Let's rename our controller class to Hello World Controller. So you can see that it's referenced all throughout the file, but I'm going to use Alt F3 inside of Visual Studio Code. It may be a different shortcut for you to take all of the instances of the weather forecast controller. And then I'm going to change this to Hello World Controller. Okay. And then I'm going to rename the controller to Hello World Controller.cs. And then I want to actually return a string instead of an enumerable list of weather forecasts. So let's change this to string. And then I actually want to change the logic inside of this get method to return hello world. Okay. Now we want to rebuild the container. And then we want to start the container to run again. Okay. So if we go to our browser, if we use the old endpoint, we should get a 404. So now if I navigate to Hello World, I'll see my new string text returned inside of the browser. Great job making it through this tutorial. In the next lesson, we're going to learn how to create a web application or a UI and Dockerize it in order to communicate with our backend, which is the web API that we just created. I'll see you in the next one.